fact, this work that I will be talking about has grown out of some really awesome collaboration we've had, Tiger and I had together on some of the applications of sentiment mining we do at LinkedIn. So the focus of today's talk is going to be on data, on how we can improve sentiment classification on social media through mostly data refinements. This is in contrast with some also very important work on algorithm refinements. So the focus of today will be solely on how we can leverage the data the most to our advantage. So as has already been discussed today in a keynote talk, as well as in some of the first session talks, social media opinion mining is incredibly important for and useful for businesses. In fact, businesses of the smallest size to multi-million-dollar corporations require understanding of what people are saying about them on social media. The purpose of opinion mining is to obtain relevant, informative, and actionable insights into public sentiment about the company's products or services. There have been numerous advancements in various approaches to doing sentiment, from the very early naive Bayes to SVM to the more recent deep learning, as we had just heard about. And so there have been tons and tons and tons of modeling work and huge improvements. However, it is true that various classifiers come and go, but data is forever. And the focus of today, as I said, will be on how much improvement can we make if we focus on just the data refinement. So this is today's theme. In no way should it downplay the importance of algorithm refinements. It's just a different focus. So a short prelude of data and classifiers. So specifically to sentiment mining on social media data, it is very challenging. We already saw today several examples of how it can be challenging. The data is very fragmented, it's unstructured, it's hugely ambiguous. The sentiment mining itself is a subjective task. What some people could say, this is positive, it depends on context, it depends on the person who's judging, etc. Also, a lot of the time when we look at social media like Twitter, it's kind of not relevant. So it may contain some sentiment, but it's not really about what you care. And so even when it is relevant, it still varies greatly with respect to informativeness. And this is something that was really highlighted beautifully in the previous talk on the LSTM and actionable insights. And so today I will continue with these themes. And of course, having this noisy data results in various problems for classifiers, no matter how powerful they are. Specifically, inconsistent data produces simply poor classifier results, because we love machine learning, but machine learning isn't magic learning, and you can't learn things if the data is inconsistent. Moreover, non-relevant data produces uninformative results. So that's something that, again, was touched upon in the previous talk, that even if the data is correctly labeled for sentiment, it still may not be exactly the sentiment about the thing you care. And so it doesn't really inform you. So the goal, of course, is to improve insightful sentiment classification. For today, I will present it via a lens of a certain case study on a Twitter and Facebook data that we collect at LinkedIn in order to understand what people are saying about us. And so I will give a glimpse of the raw data that I will be speaking about. So the data source is publicly available social media posts mentioning LinkedIn and grouped into these macro categories like jobs or endorsements or inbox or what have you. This data comes basically scraped from Twitter and using some keyword searches and grouped into these buckets. And oftentimes it's hugely kind of irrelevant. Sometimes it's very relevant, and sometimes it's just noise. So some examples: the next big thing you missed, LinkedIn's quest to get a job for everyone on earth. So that's kind of relevant. Or research shows that 75% of jobs are found through networking compared to 10% through advertisements and 5% through job fair. Something about jobs, not sure if it's relevant. Or understanding networking and using hashtag LinkedIn as a tool to help you find a job, sort of relevant. LinkedIn is where recruiters, employers, job seekers, and professionals come together, more relevant. So it's kind of a bit of a mix. And sometimes you actually do find something that you really should pay attention about if it's concerns some new release or of a new app. And you kind of really want to filter out the noise and look at the more relevant tweets. And so the goal of a sentiment classifier that is trained on this type of social media post that you just saw is to find positive, negative, and neutral sentiment and display insightful results. And the primary purpose of this is to understand public sentiment about company or products and then to take appropriate actions. So this gets actually presented to various stakeholders and product owners, so then they can look at the overall sentiment, look at some examples of tweets or Facebook posts where it came from, and make appropriate decisions. And so, of course, the question that echoes previous talks is, are all the social media posts equally insightful? And the answer is no. Specifically, we can look at it as two questions. One is, what does neutral mean? So when we say this sentiment is neutral about this particular, in this particular tweet or Facebook post, that could mean one of two things. Like LinkedIn's new app is okay. Well, that's kind of a tepid attitude towards product, fine. Versus, come check my new profile on #LinkedIn. Well, it's actually also doesn't really, it's not just neutral, it doesn't really express anything relevant about the company. And so the word neutral is kind of dangerously ambiguous in that sense, especially if we consider, as a little preview of what's to come, that most of these training data that we have is labeled neutral, but in reality it's actually something different. And the second question is, when sentiment is non-neutral, is it actually informative? Like LinkedIn is a great way to connect with professionals and find jobs. Well, that's positive and informative because it's about, if you're some stakeholder and you're looking at these tweets and you're saying, oh, people like our job app or some, the LinkedIn app for connecting with professionals, that's kind of neat. Versus, I woke up so happy, so I went to see who viewed my profile on LinkedIn. Well, that's also positive, but it's not about LinkedIn. And so if you see a lot of the tweets or Facebook posts of the type in 4, which is the non-informative one, you shouldn't be yet celebrating. So the two questions reduce to really finding informative sentiment. So first I will talk about the existing sentiment classifier, which is the SVM model trained on about 10,000 labeled social media posts, labeled as positive, negative, or neutral. How it was collected is that it was crowdsourced and then vetted by in-house experts sort of to ensure that the data is indeed representative of what we understand to be neutral, negative, and positive. And the labels are neutral means contains no sentiment, and there's also a label unknown, which is kind of a gibberish or foreign language or whenever people can't decide really what it means. So some examples is how to rock your LinkedIn profile and get jobs would be neutral. Hey, LinkedIn peeps, come back and check my website. I have some hot jobs posted there. That's positive, even though it notices it's not really about LinkedIn. And some blah, blah, blah gibberish is unknown. And the key assumption that underlies this is the training data is kind of all equally informative and equally relevant. Then if we look again at the evaluation on an independently taken test set, we will see that it's about in a 69-70% accuracy. So what it means correct is when our rating agrees with that of crowd workers. And so we crowdsourced about 3,000 of these sentiment rated posts, and we got about 1,900 correct. And so most errors is actually when we rate a post positive or negative, but in reality it is neutral. So that's the bad red numbers. And if the real problem with that is that if we say that, okay, we have this many positive or this many negative social media posts, and some person who is reviewing this looks at it, they have seemingly a reason to be happy because they have so much positive, but in reality is mostly neutral. So we really have a huge error on the false positive identification of positives. In reality, they aren't. So if we were somehow to reduce those red numbers, we would have made some improvement. And so in order to do that, we want to understand what really is causing this. And the way to do that is first to look at the the data, as to understand what might be in the data that is causing it. And then we look at the data and we find that actually like 90% of this training set is labeled neutral. But even at a closer look, it's actually not neutral. It's more like off topic. So, and the problem is these uninformative posts in the training data cause a dilution of insights. So to mitigate that, and let's propose a ranking approach. What does that mean is to promote the more informative posts. And how we're going to do this is primarily by focusing on the data aspect as opposed to on going and digging into the sentiment classifier aspect. So one can do it two different ways. One can say, oh my God, our model is terrible. We have to go and like fix the model and then spend some time on that, which is a perfectly legitimate way to do it unless something is fundamentally biased in the training set, and you could never really make that progress because your training set is inherently not making it impossible for you to learn what you want. So we're actually going to do something really different. We're going to keep the sentiment classifier exactly as it is because we're just going to keep it as a steady, unchanging variable. And we're going to do something else. We're going to build an informativeness classifier that will label posts as informative and uninformative and kind of add it as a classification layer, a kind of a filter on top of the sentiment one. So then we can combine the results in a way where we rate every post for sentiment and then for informativeness, and we will downrank but not remove those posts that are considered uninformative by the second layer classifier, while they consider to have sentiment by the sentiment labeling classifier. So that we will never remove anything. We will just say, yeah, this has sentiment according to sentiment classifier, but according to this informativeness classifier, we believe it doesn't really have much information, and so we're going to vote it a lower. And one would ask, so isn't that kind of a modeling approach? And the answer is not really, and why we will see in a moment. So, and why will be specifically in how we're going to choose to build this informativeness classifier and what it means. So it's going to still be rooted in a data perspective. So what is informative? So first we have to, before we build such classifier, we need to understand what we're trying to model. And what does informative mean? Unfortunately, the bad news is that informative is kind of in the eye of the beholder. So here I will again draw a parallel with the previous talk, where that was focused even more on the laser-specific notion of informativeness, where informativeness meant actionability. In this case, I'm looking at something that is a little bit broadly construed as informative. So informative means related to the topic of. So we can have a working definition of informative where a post is informative if and only if it is a concise statement about the company and its products. Okay, then what does it mean to be about? That's kind of reducing it to another unknown notion. Well, we can say a post Y is about X if and only if X is subject of the sentence contained in a post, such as LinkedIn is some social network, or LinkedIn has or LinkedIn does blah. X is subject of a possessive, like LinkedIn's new feature is useful, or X appears in the beginning of the post or within like some very small window. So and that's something in the literature on topic discovery has been kind of a set of heuristics people use to train some classifiers on discovering topics in sentences or topics in news feed, etc. So our working definition of what is informative is not necessarily actionable. It is just about the company. So some examples of something that's informative and contains sentiment, like LinkedIn is a great way to connect with professionals. This is not actionable, but it is pertaining to LinkedIn. So if you were a stakeholder to see that kind of a type of tweet, you would notice that, yeah, people like LinkedIn, or LinkedIn is a social media platform of choice for both recruiters and job seekers. So like, yes, people are talking about LinkedIn in this positive way with respect to job applications or finding jobs. A LinkedIn endorsement is a nice way to show someone that you notice and value their skills. So here, LinkedIn is not the subject, but it is actually in the very first few words of the post. Now we're going to contrast that with what we consider non-informative posts according to the definition I provided. So I went on LinkedIn today feeling great about my next job opportunity here. On LinkedIn is in the modifier kind of embedded under a preposition. It contains sentiment because there is feeling great and job opportunity. That's kind of upvoted as for the sentiment purposes, but it's actually not about LinkedIn specifically. Come check out my new LinkedIn profile. LinkedIn is like way down in the post. Top ways to use the LinkedIn Business Social Network. Again, this is not, LinkedIn is not in the prominent topic or subject position. So from this, a set of observations emerge. So first observation is that informative versus non-informative posts are different in some structural ways. Informative posts are shorter, they're more concise. The topic, in this case LinkedIn or LinkedIn's products, appear in the beginning of the posts, like LinkedIn's or LinkedIn has or LinkedIn is. Non-informative posts, on the other hand, are longer. LinkedIn tends to be mentioned like way toward the end, and it's used in some modifier position. It's not in a subject position. And of these heuristics, having looked at a lot of posts, I will say that probably the most fundamental property is that LinkedIn tends to be in a subject position when it's informative, and the post is much shorter. So the longer the post is, the more likely it's like about something else. The second observation is that consistent and generalizable differences can be exploited to automatically label training data. And that's an important observation in this case, because what we want to do is kind of avoid having to crowdsource when we're building this classifier as much as possible. It's not going to be possible to completely avoid it, but we can avoid it to a large extent. And so we can construct a training set focusing, again, primarily on the data and then not on the generalizations that emerge through the data, and build, like bootstrap this informativeness classifier from the ground up just by looking at the data heuristics. And this is what I mean, where even though we're adding the second layer of classification, we're really not building it as a classifier in a classical sense where we have some label data where we manually create it and we create some manual features. We're just using data internal heuristics to label the data automatically. So we can produce a 30,000 non-informative and almost 90-some thousand informative examples by automatically labeling informative, uninformative based on the heuristics above, like is it subject of the sentence, is it short, does LinkedIn appear within like first 3 or 4 words of the post. And then we're going to reuse the exactly same model that we had for sentiment, so that it is not even, we're not even adding a new model. We're just using the same model with the same parameters. The point is to completely downplay the modeling angle and see how much we can still get. Except we're going to train it on the informativeness data, and so it's going to be a binary classifier. And then there's no special features, there's just bag of words. It's basically going to try to learn based on these labels and based on the way words positioned in the labeled data. And so we only want to make the difference only via the different training set, and perhaps it is somewhat artificial, but the point is to understand how much is the contribution of this data. And then if it is significant, then we can make all kinds of improvements. But once we understand this, we will be kind of in business. So then we will have to, of course, crowdsource some data in order to get a golden set so we can understand sort of how much is our error. And the evaluation and an unseen test set with respect to informativeness shows that overall we do in about 79% correct area. Non-informative posts are labeled correctly almost 90% of the time, so we have a very high confidence in finding something that is uninformative, whereas informativeness, the agreement with people on whether something is informative is, of course, much lower. That's expected, so it's like in the 40s. And the reason is because these specific heuristics are kind of both hard to communicate to humans, and I will have some stuff to say about that towards the end of the talk, but also it's a really, really tough criterion to hit. And that's another reason why when we are rating the sentiment bearing posts for informativeness, we are actually not removing the informative ones because we are aware that we can accidentally remove something that is carrying information. So we will illustrate this whole flow in this one picture as follows. So we train the sentiment classifier. That's already there, that exists, and that's our level 1 classifier. Then we train an informativeness classifier on this automatically labeled data, which is labeled informative or non-informative, regardless of whether it has sentiment or not. It's subject to completely different criteria of what it means to contain informative content. And then at test time, we will rate for sentiment and produce positive, negative, or neutral. And if suppose something is positive, we will apply this informativeness classifier, and then we will judge whether or not to promote it or downvote it, depending on whether or not it is judged as informative or non-informative according to the second layer classification. And then we will promote the informative posts on top. So here, again, I will provide additional justification for why this sort of approach is valid and relevant. It's if we look again at the picture of our sentiment classification and we notice, our numbers in terms of false positive, neutral predicted positive, and neutral predicted negative, then we can ask a question like this: how many sentiment labeled examples are also labeled informative by humans? So we can show this set and ask humans a very different question. We're going to say, don't rate it positive, negative, or neutral. Tell me how much are informative versus uninformative. And I will explain in a second half of this talk exactly what it means to ask humans this question. That's not actually very straightforward. So, and it turns out that very little is informative to humans as well, which makes this approach of rating for informativeness in addition to sentiment a legitimate one. Specifically, humans rate about 77% of this entire data set as actually not informative. So it makes sense to downvote things based on informativeness because of this fact that there is a lot of diluted information found there according to people. So what we will do is, because we have faith that, in fact, a lot of it is not informative, so we're not super worried, we will want to reduce this dilution by ranking. So when we apply second-level informativeness classifier, we will be able to, turns out, downvote 408 out of 565 neutral posts that were labeled positive, and 194 posts from the original 271 neutral, quote-unquote, actually non-informative, labeled negative. So the total number of downvoted non-informative posts is in about 72%. And the cost for it, of course, is not zero. We will also downvote some informative posts because that's kind of how the game is. But because we're not removing it, it's okay. And because there is actually very few informative posts, even if they appear to the bottom, you can still read the whole thing. Whereas if you had to read like 500 or 600 posts as a stakeholder and to kind of get a sense of what people are saying, that's much harder. So when we look at the results of the same classification with removal of the uninformative posts, we will see these grayed out numbers means that they were downvoted due to being rated as uninformative. So we will produce a slightly different picture, which is that total sentiment rated correctly and promoted is 625 posts out of total posts labeled with sentiment and promoted, meaning considered informative, is just 878. And so the overall reduction in error in this false positive is significant, and it comes at the cost of also reducing some true positive. So some examples of what it looks like to remove or downvote uninformative posts, looks like this. So if we have something that's positive and informative, we promote it. So LinkedIn is known as the business professional social network, a virtual meeting place for networkers, job seekers, recruiters, and sales. So that's the kind of thing that would go on top, versus something that's positive and non-informative, a great article for those of you just starting out on LinkedIn. So it's definitely going to be rated positive for any sentiment classifier. We have seen some crazy photos of potential candidates out here. Let me start off by saying LinkedIn is a professional social media platform. No matter if you are looking for a network, find a job, let's keep it classy. It's just some sort of post that's very tangentially about LinkedIn, although positive. So you kind of want to see it much later, if at all. Conversely, something that's negative and non-informative, posts that mention illegal drug usage will earn a negative reaction from 83% of recruiters, not surprising. Recruiters focus their attention on social media profiles with social networks like LinkedIn. Why wouldn't they? So again, this is rated negative by a classifier, probably correctly, but at the same time, it is not really interesting or informative with respect to LinkedIn. So at this point, I would like to transition to a slightly different aspect of this talk, which is about crowdsourcing. So we did some crowdsourcing to understand sentiment labeling accuracy as well as informativeness labeling. And oftentimes what happens is crowdsourcing is done, but not so much attention is paid to the way the task is set up. And that is extremely important when it comes to trying to elicit very subjective and very kind of vague, ambiguous types of judgments. So let's start with sentiment task. We want to understand how well we did, and so we want to get a golden ground truth set labeled with positive, negative, and neutral, so then we can run our classifier on top of that and understand the agreement. So what we definitely want to do here is we want to avoid being vague. So we want to avoid something like asking the Crowdflower or Crowd, whatever platform we have, to say, is this post positive, negative, or neutral? Thanks, goodbye. Like, that would be really vague. And people will vary hugely with respect to their answers. And even if you get some agreements, these agreements might actually tell you something very different than just the fact that the answer is correct. So how are we going to avoid vagueness is by explicitly defining and providing examples of positive, negative, and neutral, and through multiple iterations of quiz mode, where we can filter out people who do not follow our directions, we will hopefully get to a much more steady type of responses, much more stable. So what is positive? Positive expresses, okay, positive feelings towards company or product. What does positive feeling mean? It means something like, I love how LinkedIn helped me search for relevant jobs. And then there is a bunch of examples of what positive attitudes mean. Negative is actually much more than just expressing a negative feeling or a complaint or a confusion. It is even things like asking a question about user interface, which should technically be obvious. That's very negative. So if you, let's say, someone says, how do I use this job search app? Or why do I get random messages? This is a negative post, because it should be obvious how to use a job search app, or it should be obvious that one should not get random messages. So through providing examples like this, we can get the crowd to give us the kinds of responses that align with our interpretation of what positive, negative, and neutral means. And neutral finally expresses a tepid opinion or states a fact. So I used the job app and it was okay, that's tepid opinion, and LinkedIn went public in 2012, that's just a fact. So, or LinkedIn got acquired by Microsoft, which is the more relevant fact. Notice that in this task, we do not ask anything about informativeness, because that would be confusing, because that's kind of a second, that's a second type of question, it's orthogonal. So the sentiment elicitation task focuses only on good, bad, neutral. The second task for informativeness, which we set up in order to rate the informativeness classifier, is, again, trying to avoid vagueness. So we do not ask, is this post informative? This is much more too open-ended, and what's informative for me is not informative for you, and pretty much anything that allows me to learn a new bit of information by definition is informative. It reduces entropy, so it's informative, but that's not really what we want. So how do we set up this task? And so I've actually experimented with very different setups, and finally the one that gave the best result in terms of both Crowdflower happiness, so the workers can be happy or unhappy with the clarity of the task, and that should give you the sense of like how well you're doing, as well as how easy it is to get a lot of agreements on a very short set of questions. So if you have like 100 questions and you're not able to get any agreements, that means something is wrong with the task. So finally, this task, like phrasing it as a multiple choice and then giving examples in like for every possible scenario that you can think of, as well as tips, really helps. So the task is phrased kind of in a very course level manner, which is determine the topic of a social media post, and instead of asking, is it informative? And so while determining the topic is also a little bit vague, humans are actually really good at finding out those very heuristics that we used to understand whether something is a topic, like is it in the beginning of the sentence, is it subject of the predication, even though most people who are not technical may not even know what a subject of the sentence is. But overall, through repetition, they actually converge on that. And so, and then they're given choices to select the best choice that represents the answer, like LinkedIn or LinkedIn's products or services. That means it's informative. This is what it translates into our sort of experimental setup. But they don't need to know about this. They just need to answer this question. Versus something other than LinkedIn or LinkedIn's product or services. That means it's not really informative. Or I don't even know what it's about. And that also means, of course, it's not informative. So, and then crowdflower workers are given some tips, like the main topic of a post usually appears in the beginning of the post, and then they are given it as a tip, but not actually given it as an instruction, which is it may be the subject of the sentence. So to give it as an instruction kind of biases people to have to know what the subject of the sentence is, but if you put it in the tips, it kind of is helpful if they know what it is, and they can ignore it if they don't. And so some examples that are given is like, LinkedIn is a great tool for job seekers. This is about LinkedIn. Or I had a nice conversation with a coworker and then connected with him on LinkedIn. That's really not. And then throughout the task, they're given these kind of test questions that if they get 10 or so wrong, they get kicked off the platform. And then this it kind of iterates until finally we're able to find a set of people who can follow the instructions and can generalize and produce some sort of reliable results. So in sum, the goal of sentiment analysis in a kind of an industry setting, regardless of whether you're a very small industry or a really big industry or a very big company, is to discover informative sentiment in social media posts, where informative can mean super informative like actionable, or just informative like, does this new app make people happy or sad? Where the new app is something you produced and so you really want to hear about it. The focus is how we can improve the existing classification results with respect to informativeness by focusing solely on data refinements. And our data refinements came in the form of having this additional classification layer on top of sentiment that would downplay or somehow filter out these obscuring, non-informative posts. So the constraint is to reuse existing models with minimal tuning or with minimal retraining. Why this constraint is partly because we want to know how much progress you can make with just data focus and with focusing it in a way where you don't even use crowd workers to label multiple amounts of multiple thousands of examples. Again, why? Well, because it's expensive and because you want to see how much automation of the data labeling you can get away with if you can. And so we approach this as a two-level classification problem where the first level, which is sentiment classifier, is already there, and just we keep it exactly steady as it is. And the second layer is the informativeness classifier, which is built, trained on the automatically labeled data as informative versus uninformative with no new added features, and is just used to downvote uninformative posts. The resulting improvement is that we were able to downvote 72% of these uninformative and hence kind of information diluting posts, which were labeled incorrectly positive or negative while in reality they were neutral or uninformative, really. And that leads to a more precise and more interesting insights. One of the more important future directions is to actually retrain the classifier for sentiment on informative posts only, which would make sense, except for because there is such impoverishment of data, it would take some time to actually collect the appropriate amount of informative and sentiment-bearing data posts. So in sum, I would like to actually thank Tiger for his kind of inspiration and his collaboration on the work that led up to this. It was really, a lot of it is based on our prior work. And thank you, and questions. Yes, I think you should go to there.
First, thank you. It was very interesting. You are talking about two classifiers, and they are dependent. And you mentioned here that you want to retrain the sentiment classifier. My question is, what about the informative? Why not training the informative only on sentiment-related posts?
So perhaps you can train informativeness classifier on sentiment, like positive or negative, you mean? Like only on positive or negative? Mm-hmm. You can, and that's kind of another way to do this. The idea is we also want to understand if something is neutral and non-informative. So actually using only two classes might kind of make it unable to recognize when something is presented to it that is technically neutral, but is also informative, or neutral and uninformative, because this is a different dimension.
So neutral and informative is something that you are interested in?
Technically, we can say that if, suppose we really want to understand, so this is an excellent point, but suppose you want to understand what is the spectrum of people's reactions to a new app, and you can say, we want to know if it's very happy, very bad, or kind of in between. So this is where it could be relevant or informative, but it's kind of like tepid. Yeah.
Okay.
There's 1 and 2, so I think people should just come up. And, yeah. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. First, you said you recruit the co-workers for labeling. So
not crowd workers.
Crowd workers.
Yeah. I thought you said co-workers.
Sorry.
Sorry.
And how many crowd workers labeled one sentence?
3.
3 of them. And then how did you, decide based on the majority of, for example, saying that positive?
So absolutely. So there always 3 people at least, right? And then Crowdflower, which is a platform through which we crowdsource, has some kind of a agreement score, which is when at least two people have to agree, and then they each have what's called a trustworthiness score, and that score is computed over their presumably lifetime on the platform and how well they do, etc. And so anything that was 0.6 or greater was selected, and everything below it was discarded. So you had to be at least 2 out of 3, and each worker had to have some trustworthiness.
And then, for example, if you had 1 positive, 1 negative, and 1 neutral from your 3 of your labeling, then what did you do? Just all of that? Okay. And then the other question is when you're ranking for the informative and informative, or even positive, negative, did you also consider another, kind of ranking, like, because the labeling is completely fuzzy. So, like, a neutral can be considered as maybe little negative, or
Yes. So,
like
so I did not do any of the spectrum. So it was only good, bad, meh, and informative or non-informative. So of course, recent work shows that there is a huge spectrum, and you can do at least 5, but not at this point. So maybe in a going forward. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, so after you'd put together the hand-built heuristics for informativeness, for labeling the data, as a baseline, did you try just using those instead of actually training a classifier And if so, how much better did the classifier do than...
I actually did not, but it's something that occurred to me, and one of the reasons is because I did not want to introduce yet another classifier. So notice that that would be like having a rule-based classifier.
Right, yeah.
And so what I wanted to do, and this is an excellent point, is to just have a single classifier, which is the same model as was used for sentiment.
So they both use the same features,
Absolutely.
but it's just with a
They're
different
completely
label set.
different. They're completely identical. It's the same code that was only given. The only one variable difference is that the labeling of the data.
Cool.
And the resulting 2 versus 3 classifier. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, I had a question. I was wondering if you like think of looking at emotions and like more, not just like different degrees of polarity in sentiments, like positive and negative, but like joy, anger. Because I'm just wondering what made you think that like positive and negative are like very good, like what valuable.
That's just it's a very there's a very pragmatic answer to this. So the point is to make an improvement on something that exists, and what exists right now is the sort of the sentiment positive, negative, neutral approach. One can also do that same thing with angry, happy, sad approach. It was just that would mean also building this other new classifier and an informativeness classifier. So this was just sort of going off of what exists and see how much error reduction or downvoting can be done. But that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent talk. Thank you. My question is about the 10,000 sample data set that you started with. Did you do any experimentation with larger data sets to see if they would actually compensate for not having the improvement by the informative classifier?
So no, although that's something that I'm definitely thinking of doing, and one of the reasons is what's almost impossible to do is to heuristically label the data for sentiment, because that's just too varied, and you really do need humans for it, and that's a lot of money. So to get much more, like with the informativeness classifier, I could automatically label 30,000 and 90,000, but I could do 300,000 and 500,000, and that doesn't cost me anything. But this is just a pragmatic constraint again. Thank you.
Nice talk.
Thank you.
I have one question about this kind of research. There are a lot of the posts on Amazon website about the product, like people like or dislike the product. How do you think your method and terminology, informativeness and formativeness, to use on those kind of text?
On Amazon?
Amazon, maybe eBay, maybe Walmart, this kind of
So
product.
I actually did some other research specifically on Amazon reviews of products, and if we're talking about the same type of reviews, oftentimes they're like one-liners: shipped on time, great condition. Yes. So I would have to say that you can do something very similar, where you would have a training model on positive, negative, or neutral, where your labels could come from the star ratings or through manual, annotation, whatever. And then the informativeness would have to be, is it even about this product? And here it's kind of harder because the text is so short that sometimes they may not even mention the product. So to understand what is informative with respect to this very short review, that might take some maybe either different heuristics to bootstrap or like looking more at the data, because if you have a one line, it may not actually mention that product. A lot of the time they just start with the verb saying arrived on time or didn't arrive, and then you have to infer that that's what they're talking about, in which case it's informative, versus if they go on and rant about their mother or something, then that's not informative. But a very similar type of heuristics could be applied, but they would need to be slightly different for this data set. But I think it's possible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My question is, I think in the process of the informativeness classifier, you should extract the subject from the sentences. I want to know, how did you extract the subject from sentences?
So in this particular case, I actually did a very simple like manual heuristic by saying, I have these verbs, I know they're verbs like is, has, and such because they appear a lot. And then I was looking for like in a position of like LinkedIn, and then it has these very few hand curated set of verbs. In reality, which you could do much better, and that's something that I just didn't try because of time constraint, is to actually apply a part of speech tagger on top, and then have the subject, and then anything that has NN, VB, NN, VBN, whatever parts, patterns would be your guide.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
By the way, I think this is going to be very useful and pragmatic utility. I operate in a space which has much larger text, and very often we attach the sentiment to entities within the text.
Right.
Specifically real-world entities, companies,
Yeah.
products, etc. But this guidance, especially in the area of getting the training data put together correctly, is quite powerful.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for the talk. It was
Thank you.
very informative. I wanted to ask, actually, regarding the two classifiers, since they're both given the same feature sets, did you do any analysis, and I might have missed this in the presentation, or study on which features were most useful or relevant or highly weighted regarding informativeness, and maybe if you compared or contrasted those with the features that were most relevant regarding sentiment?
So I actually did not do a full-on study, but I surmise, because they are just bag of word features, that for informativeness, that would be things like presence of, the word like LinkedIn or LinkedIn's, and then followed by be or have. So the existence of those in close proximity, or even like existence of those together somewhere, versus something like existence of good, bad, words like happy, sad, because these are bag of word features that would appear like good, bad, and blah would appear in informativeness classifier regardless of the class. So they shouldn't bias you. So I specifically sampled the data in such a way that it would contain, for the informativeness classifier, a representation of good, bad, and neutral in each of the classes, so that it doesn't learn that informative means good or informative means bad, because that's exactly what I don't want it to learn.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because there could be different regarding the data set and how you collected the data. The way there could be patterns that emerge, right?
Absolutely.
Between, right, that could vary depending on either some latent variable, right, because of the where you're getting it from,
Yes.
or because of the actual informativeness, right, determines the way people speak about it.
Yes,
So that would
absolutely.
be
So that would be very interesting
yeah,
to look at.
So thank you for
Thank
the
you.
response.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the talk.
Thanks.
Yeah, so question about the informative definition. So right now you are giving us a lot of example about how the LinkedIn or how the people is used to with LinkedIn. Sounds like it is a single target. Do you have any example which is about the multiple task? For example, you give us an example saying, I feel very good, so I go to LinkedIn, right? So that's you label as not informative. But actually it gave us another message which is like, I feel good today. So do you consider that as an informative message for my status, now the LinkedIn? So basically that means if by one sentence can you extract some multiple tasks, which some of them actually is informative and some to some other subject which might not
Absolutely,
be.
it's completely relative. And the point is that when the task was set up for crowdsourcing to do the test data labeling, and in terms of training data, it was automated, but the goal was informative with respect to our task. And so they're asked, what is the topic of this very broadly, and then Is it about LinkedIn? Is it about something else? So in the case of I feel very good, it would be about something else. It might be informative, but I would not consider it because I'm only looking to find it informative with respect to entity. In fact, the word informative is kind of empty otherwise, because any word you utter makes information greater than silence. And so the point is to only look at it as a relative target.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So,
Thank you.
Nice talk. Let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.